So today we're going to dig into a really provocative argument about the US Constitution. What if its biggest weaknesses aren't in the document at all? What if the real problem is, well, us, our own way of thinking? Let's get into it. All right, so the whole thing kicks off with this really sharp question. Why does it seem like the Constitution isn't enough to protect its own principles anymore? The source material frames this by pointing to what it calls an onslaught of progressive legislation, stuff that seems to challenge the very foundation of the country. And the answer the source gives is, well, it's a total curveball. The argument is that the Constitution didn't fail. Not at all. In fact, it's always been adequate. The problem, according to this view, is with us. So what on earth does that mean? To even begin to understand that claim, we have to unpack this core idea from the source material. It's this concept of two different but totally connected constitutions. Okay, so on one hand, you've got the Constitution, the actual legal document. But on the other side, there's what the source calls our Constitution. And you can think of this as our internal operating system, our shared understanding of reality, of common sense, of basic human nature. The whole argument here is that the physical document, the law, can only work if our internal human constitution is healthy. They need each other to survive. So this gets into that famous idea, when the founders talked about needing a moral people. The source argues they weren't calling for a state religion, not even close. They meant a population that was grounded in what philosophers call metaphysical realism. It's just a fancy way of saying we all agree that an objective reality exists, that there is a true north out there that's real, regardless of our personal feelings about it. Okay, so if our internal compass is off, you gotta ask, where did things go wrong? The source traces the root of the problem all the way back to a single, pivotal moment in the history of philosophy. Which brings us to the next logical question, right? If someone wanted to weaken that shared grounding in reality, how would they even start? How could you possibly unmoor an entire society from its own common sense? Well, the source points to this timeline, this huge shift in thinking. For centuries, the dominant idea was scholastic realism, basically that reality is real and it exists outside of our heads. But then the philosopher René Descartes comes along and flips the script. Suddenly, the focus shifts inward, and thought itself becomes the main thing to study. According to this argument, that one subtle change opened the door for all kinds of modern ideologies where, as the source says, man becomes the measure of all things. Subjective feeling starts to compete with objective fact. And this quote from Thomas A. Howe really nails the gravity of this shift. It wasn't just some academic debate. The source frames it as a fundamental error, one that has become the plague of modern philosophy. It's essentially the origin story for a world where personal perception can start to override external truth. Now you might think, okay, an abstract philosophical idea, so what? But ideas have consequences, right? And the author argues this one didn't just stay in the university library. It was put into action through a very specific and very powerful mechanism, the classroom. So the source poses this strategic question. If you want a population to give up the very principles that are supposed to limit the power of the state, you can't just force them. So how do you get them to do it willingly, generation after generation? And here's the answer, and it's pretty chilling. You don't attack the law head on. That's too obvious. Instead, you subvert the person. You change their fundamental understanding of who they are, of their own nature, and their connection to reality. You target their internal constitution. The source lays out this ancient playbook for subversion. First, you teach things about human nature that aren't true. But, and this is the key, you mix those lies with just enough truth to make them sound plausible. And for a generation that's already been philosophically unmoored, that mixture becomes almost impossible to pick apart. The lies just sort of sink in. And get this isn't some newfangled debate. The source points all the way back to Adam Ferguson, a guy who was around during the founding. And even back in 1767, he was already calling out what he called the sophistry of these abstract theories about human nature. This just goes to show, the founders were right in the middle of these philosophical wars themselves. So what did this look like in the real world? Well, according to the source, it happened in the classroom. The argument is that educational institutions started promoting thinkers like Hobbes and Rousseau, whose ideas could be used to justify more and more state power. At the same time, they allegedly started erasing the very philosophy the founders relied on, Scottish common sense realism. So in effect, students were cut off from the intellectual foundations of their own country. Okay, so this was clearly a long game, a multi-generational strategy. It wasn't an overnight thing. But you have to ask, what was the end game? What was the ultimate goal of all this alleged subversion? And this is where it all leads. From this point of view, all these different ideological movements, from that first philosophical error to the changes in the classroom, they all serve one single purpose: to consolidate power in the hands of the state. The idea is, if you weaken a person's internal sense of reality and self-reliance, you make them way more dependent on external authority.
And this, the source says, creates a really clever trap. It's called a contrived dialectical framework. It's like, imagine a boxing ring where both fighters, left and right, are actually working for the same promoter, the state. They're both arguing over the details of state power, how to use it, who gets to use it, but they're no longer questioning its fundamental limits because they've both been disconnected from those original grounding principles of the founders.
All right, so after walking through this whole pretty bleak picture of how we got here, what's the solution? Where do we go from here? The author argues the answer lies in getting back to the original vision of what education is for. The solution, according to the source, is all about this concept cognitive liberty. And this is deeper than just freedom of speech. This is about nurturing the internal ability to think for yourself, to reason clearly, and to anchor your mind in objective reality. And this whole idea, it's not pulled out of thin air. It's anchored right back in the founder's own words. The source points to George Washington, who urged citizens to stay constantly awake to the enemies of a republic. And in this view, education is the #1 tool for keeping people awake and vigilant. And this really brings the whole thing into sharp focus, right? On one side, you have the modern view of education, which is often just about workforce preparedness, getting people ready for a job. But the founder's vision, according to this argument, was completely different. The main purpose of education was to equip citizens with the mental tools they needed to protect their own freedom. And so, that leaves us with the big provocative question this entire analysis has been building towards. If the source is right, if the biggest threat to liberty isn't a flaw in our laws, but a fundamental failure in how we educate ourselves and our children, then what is the true purpose of a public education? According to this argument, figuring out the answer to that question might be the most important thing we can do. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.